HighBridge, a division of recorded books, presents The Hidden Lives of Tudor Women, A Social History, by Elizabeth Norton, read by Jennifer Dixon. Preface. This is a biography. It looks at the life of a woman who was born in 1485 and died in 1603. She was a princess, a queen, a noblewoman, a merchant's wife, a servant, a rebel, a Protestant and a Catholic. She was wealthy, she was poor. She married once, twice, thrice, and not at all. She died in childbirth. She died on a burning pyre. She died at home in her bed. She spent most of her life in the house, and she left home when young and did remarkable things. She changed England and was celebrated forever, and she was forgotten, a mere footnote. She was all these things and more. She was Tudor woman, and this is her story. The ruling Tudor dynasty was bookended by two princesses named Elizabeth Tudor, the one born in 1492, whose brief years passed into obscurity, and the other who dominated her era and brought the dynasty to its close with her death in old age in 1603. Their lives are the full stops between which countless lives of other Tudor women were lived. This book is a collective biography, sampling to different extents the diverse lives enjoyed or endured by women living in Tudor England, and together constituting a multifaceted impression of female humanity of the period. A Tudor everywoman. It is a concept contemporaries would have been familiar with. After all, it was the early Tudor period that produced the allegorical play, The Summoning of Everyman. To the people of 15th and 16th century England, life could be divided into phases. The 7 ages of man, articulated most famously by Shakespeare in As You Like It, as infant, schoolboy, lover, soldier, the justice of the peace, the aging retiree, and finally the infirm elder. From the female perspective, those ages could never apply in quite the same way, in an era when women were largely denied any official public role. But even where the ages differ, there are yet analogies. If at birth our Tudor everywoman was a princess named Elizabeth, and at death a queen named Elizabeth, in between she was, among many other people, a daughter named Anne Boleyn, a servant girl turned prophetess named Elizabeth Barton, a businesswoman named Catherine Fenkell, a widow named Cecily Burbage, a rebel named Margaret Cheney, a heretic named Anne Askew, and an expatriate of advanced years named Jane Dormer. These particular names have lived on in the history books, and they provide major nodes in a network whose minor, but no less illustrative, points comprise much of what follows. The poor wool spinners of East Anglia, the witches of Surrey, and the female apprentices of Bristol, the women who taught and those who fostered learning, the women who vowed to remain chaste, and the women who made a living from sex, the women who kept their communities morally upstanding, and the women who were driven to slander, thievery, and murder, the women whose horizons seemed sunlit, and those whose lives ended in despair, in a noose tied by their own hands. For some, the experience of Tudor womanhood ended very early, as it did for the first Elizabeth Tudor, and for the unfortunate, illegitimate Mary Cheese. She, like a number of other newborn girls, found no welcome in an unsentimental world. For those that survived infancy, there was the stuff of girlhood and play, a variable education according to social class and geography, and perhaps some temporary employment or domestic service before marriage, and, for many, motherhood. With marriage, employment, in any modern sense of carrying out a paid or public role outside the home, was usually over. but other women remained unmarried and ran independent businesses as a femme sole or continued in a career. Some ended up on the wrong side of the law, others were entirely law-abiding, and a few spent a good while inside the law, embroiled in suits and countersuits. Women were not isolated from the turbulence around them. As a contested Reformation gathered pace in England, its catalyst being Henry VIII's desire for a divorce. Some women saw the light, or saw their own particular light, and in an age where public toleration of diverse opinions over religion or kingship was anathema, there were consequences for women who spoke out. Women could not be soldiers, one of Shakespeare's Middle Ages, and neither could they, with the unusual exception of 2 ruling queens, dispense justice by holding any public office. But a surprising number of women were highly political, deliberately or implicitly, whether they were motivated by desire for power, devotion to their faith, support for their family, or the myriad of other reasons that could draw them away from the home. The final 2 of the 7 ages saw the descent into old age for women, who had escaped the hazards of childbirth and the risks of disease, accident, or execution. For those who did get that far, the final years presented new challenges and great contrasts. Alice Taylor, an aged and impotent wench of Ipswich, spent her last years very differently to Elizabeth I in the 1590s, who by this time had reached her summit as Gloriana, but as both of them looked around, they would have seen more women of their own age than men. With their great longevity, many more women than men saw out all of the 7 ages. It is perhaps fitting, therefore, that the Tudor era itself reached the end of its 7th age in the last breaths of one of its most adept, extraordinary women, Elizabeth Norton. The First Age. 1. Of Babies and Bellies, Elizabeth of York and the First Elizabeth Tudor. Towards the end of January or early February 1492, Queen Elizabeth of York felt a familiar fluttering in her womb, a fluttering that provided proof she had conceived for the 4th time. Henry VII's queen was, by then, close to the midway point of her pregnancy. But in the first months of pregnancy, the condition was notoriously difficult to diagnose. Could her symptoms merely be her natural sickness or store of water? Alternatively, could her increase in girth be due to some windy matter rather than an expected baby? There were signs, of course, which could indicate pregnancy, but few physicians were prepared to confirm their diagnosis until the child actually began to stir in the womb. A mistake could be highly embarrassing for all concerned, and so for months women were left on tenterhooks. The first gentle movements, when they came, were testament to the fact that a new life had begun. For as far as most Tudors were concerned, life did not begin at conception. The man's seed entered the woman's privity, as one physician coyly called the neck of the womb, there to be met by a matching seed released by the woman. To contemporaries, these were the raw materials for a child. Most Tudor parents had a preference for boys, and once pregnancy was confirmed, they were anxious for some hint that their wish had been gratified. It was theoretically possible, asserted some physicians, to tell the sex, since boys occupied a right chamber to a subdivided womb, and girls the left. This segregation was, of course, a myth, but dreams and fond fantasies, as others rightly realized. Life itself was deemed to begin when the soul entered the fully formed fetus, which occurred at 46 days for a boy and 90 days for a girl. A Tudor girl was thus nearly 3 months in the womb before her contemporaries considered her to be a living person. The question of gender would gnaw at the minds of many Tudor parents as the mother's sickness subsided and her stomach began to swell. The wealthier sort of parents could interrogate their physicians on the sex, their questioning filling the doctors with despair. "It is very hard to know at the first whether the woman be with child or no," complained the French royal physician, Dr. Guillemot, towards the end of the 16th century, and "so by great reason must it needs be far more difficult to discern and distinguish the difference of the sex, and to determine whether it will be a boy or a wench." They were not miracle workers, but even Dr. Guillemot believed there were certain signs a mother could look for. Everyone knew that men were hotter than women, which gave them strength, intelligence, and vigour. It stood to reason, then, that younger women, who became hotter than their seniors, would bear boys. There were, it was thought, some helpful things prospective parents could do to better their chances of conceiving the right gender. Those most anxious for a boy should refrain from sexual intercourse when the wind blew southwards, since this was almost sure to result in a girl. The pregnant woman could also scrutinize her reflection. Was her complexion clear? If so, it could be a boy. Carrying a girl was harder work, and so the mother would have a pale, heavy, and swarth countenance, a melancholic eye. Boys reputedly lay higher in the womb than girls, again due to their heat, while a girl would lie at the bottom of the belly, because of her coldness and weight. Carrying a girl was even believed to affect a mother's health more adversely than carrying a boy. In early 1492, at least Queen Elizabeth of York could content herself that she had already fulfilled her dynastic duty with the births of 2 fine sons, even though death could strike down seemingly healthy children at any moment. Once pregnancy was established, it behoved a mother to ensure the health of both herself and her child. Spending her time in good-tempered air was particularly important, as was a good diet. Pregnant women also had to think about clothing, since few women owned an extensive wardrobe. Even queens adapted their existing clothes, with extra panels added to their dresses. They could supplement them with more specific maternity wear, such as self-grow waistcoats, kirtles, and gowns, which could be let out as the wearer's pregnancy advanced. To begin with, gowns could first be unlaced to make them roomier, before more drastic changes were required. Women would also think about clothes for the birth itself. It was common for Tudor women to wear a hood with a shoulder cape in which to give birth. Elizabeth of York may initially have had concerns over her 4th pregnancy, because she had conceived only 3 months after the birth of her 3rd child, Henry, on 28th of June, 1491. Her husband, heir to the House of Lancaster, had won his crown on the field at Bosworth in August 1485, inaugurating the Tudor dynasty, and his marriage to Elizabeth, who was the eldest daughter of the Yorkist, King Edward IV, had helped cement his position by unifying the houses that had fought for decades. To the royal couple, who were frequently surrounded by proud demonstrations of the new dynasty, each of their issue lawfully born helped to symbolize their union and their hold on the throne. Nonetheless, such a rapid new pregnancy in 1492, almost certainly an accident, was a cause for concern, given the very real dangers that threatened women in pregnancy and childbirth. Pleading the belly. Pregnancy was always a possibility for sexually active Tudor women of childbearing age, and heirs to crowns or great estates were always deemed a blessing to their parents. In quite different circumstances, the abject mystery of the Tudor prison system, women also ardently prayed for pregnancy, not for continuation of the line, but so they might defer execution by pleading the belly. In such cases, while pregnancy did not mean release from prison, it did usually serve to keep a convicted woman alive for several months, giving her supporters time to appeal for a royal pardon. Unsurprisingly, therefore, many women deliberately sought to conceive in the crowded, mixed prisons of the period. They usually had plenty of time to do so. When Edith Saunders, a London spinster, was caught rifling through the silver cabinet of a local gentleman, she pleaded her belly at her arraignment on the 7th of August, 1565. It was only on the 3rd of December, nearly 4 months later, that this claim was tested by a jury of matrons, who confirmed that she was, indeed, with child. A little short of 2 months later, the expectant mother was granted a royal pardon. Her pregnancy had saved her life. Catherine Longley, who was brought before the Kingston Assizes in March 1579, accused of stealing a woman's cassock and hat, also pleaded pregnancy. It took 4 months for her and 3 other women convicted around the same time to be examined, with all but one, by that stage, pregnant. She must have given birth in prison, since she remained incarcerated until at least March of 1581, when she was finally pardoned. Not all women were so lucky. Catherine Harrison was also convicted of stealing women's clothing at a hearing at Westminster on the 28th of November 1561, and declared herself to be pregnant. 3 months later, when her claims were investigated, the jury of matrons carried out their investigation. After an intimate examination, they pronounced pregnancy, but when she failed to display any symptoms, she was examined again on the 26th of June, 1562, and found not to be pregnant. She was sentenced to be hanged. Yet most convicted women, even those beyond childbearing age, attempted a plea of pregnancy, since the punishment for almost every offence was hanging. Old Alice Samuel, who was convicted of bewitching her neighbour's children in 1593, promptly declared herself with child on hearing the sentence, setting all the company to laughing greatly, including herself. Her daughter, Agnes, who was still of childbearing age and also convicted of witchcraft, was actively urged by those around her to plead her belly too. "No," she said, "this I will not do. It will never be said that I was both a witch and a whore." Both women were hanged. When pleading the belly resulted in a genuine birth, misfortune was very likely to pass down the generations, for where a baby was born in penal conditions, its prospects were not good, particularly if the mother failed to secure an eventual pardon and was subsequently executed. It was well known that a pregnancy lasted approximately 9 months, although it was possible for premature babies to survive being born up to 2 months early. The Queen's eldest child, Prince Arthur, had been born only 8 months into her pregnancy on the 20th of September 1486. In 1492, given Elizabeth's rapid 4th pregnancy, she had probably only just begun menstruating again when she conceived. It may have been with the pregnancy in mind that the King and Queen took up residence early at Sheen Palace, arriving there in April 1492. There was much to prepare. The baby must have a cradle filled with a wool mattress and down pillows, as well as furniture ready for the bedchambers of the child's nurse and rockers. Other high-status babies were similarly provided for, although, lower down the social scale, preparations could be rather more ad hoc. There were also preparations to be made for the mother. Giving birth was the single greatest danger that any Tudor woman could expect to face, and many mothers endured it upwards of 5 or 6 times in their lifetimes. The dangers were starkly illustrated by the fact that of the 5 English Tudor queens to give birth, 3 of them died in childbed. Any divine help was greatly appreciated. Elizabeth of York favoured the girdle of Our Lady, which belonged to Westminster Abbey, sending for it in good time for her deliveries. She could lay this precious relic over her stomach while she was in labour, the Virgin's grace alleviating the Queen's pains, as it had done for royal women over centuries. Other Tudor women relied on similar charms. As late as 1584, when superstition was supposed to have been expunged by the Reformation, the pregnant women of one town would run to church and tie their girdles or shoe latchets about a bell, and strike upon the same thrice, thinking that the sound thereof hastened their good delivery. There was little other prospect of pain relief. For Elizabeth of York, more than for other women, there was a ceremony to be followed as she prepared for the birth. Luckily for the Queen, she had a set of ordinances to follow, giving her step-by-step instructions on exactly how to proceed for every confinement. First, it was up to Elizabeth to select a room in which to give birth. With her pleasure being understood, her attendants got to work, covering the ceiling, walls, and even the windows with rich hangings to create a dark, stuffy space in the early summer heat. Elizabeth could at least afford candles, which were out of the reach of her poorer subjects, but the atmosphere must still have seemed oppressive. Only one window was curtained with fabric that could actually be removed, allowing her to have light when it pleaseth her. Sounds were muted in a room so swathed in fabric that even the floor and furniture were covered. Yet it was a gorgeous, luxurious space, with hangings specifically chosen for the Queen, depicting golden fleur-de-lis on a rich blue background. Elizabeth was careful to keep the images neutral and uncomplicated, since figurative representations were not convenient about women in such case. It would not do for either the mother's mind or the child's to become unsettled, reasoned contemporaries. This cushioned space was dominated by a rich bed, heavily embroidered and gloriously fine. But while this hefty statement of her royal rank took up much of the room, Elizabeth would have balked at using it for her labour. Women of all classes were advised to set up a little pallet bed on which to give birth. This was a sensible precaution, since beds and their coverings were often the most expensive items that a family owned, and birth was messy. Poorer women brought out their bearing sheets for each confinement, and in spite of their utility, these sheets could have sentimental value and be passed down the generations as family heirlooms. It was common for women to leave them to their daughters in their wills. Elizabeth's pallet was rather more grand than the usual, and hung with rich curtains suspended from the ceiling. While it was not mentioned in the ordinances, the Queen insisted that an altar be erected in her room for her private devotions, ensuring that it be well furnished with relics. It would have been on this that Our Lady's girdle rested until such time as it was required. With everything ready for the birth, there was nothing to do but wait. The Queen was best placed to know when the moment had come to enter her confinement. It was usually around a month before the birth. In spring 1492, while a heavily pregnant Elizabeth looked for her quiet, her husband was restless at Sheen. He needed something to occupy himself, and in May he ordered his clerk of works to build lists at the palace for a great tournament. He also paid, out of his own purse, for spears and other jousting weapons. The tournament lasted more than a month, sometimes taking place within the palace and sometimes moving to the green outside. Elizabeth's last few weeks of pregnancy proved far from restful for her, as competitors and spectators packed the palace. For others, it was a jolly, companionable time. King Henry himself took part in archery contests on the 4th of June. taking his losses in good part too. For Elizabeth of York, the festivities were marred by news that her mother had fallen gravely ill. Elizabeth Woodville had been a regular presence at her daughter's earlier confinements, but by 1492 she had been living in retirement at Bermondsey Abbey for some years. Twice widowed and fiercely devoted to her children, the 55-year-old widow of Edward IV made her last will in April 1492, sensing that her death was imminent. The 8 months pregnant Elizabeth of York could not make the journey to Bermondsey to be present at her mother's death on the 8th of June, nor attend the funeral service at Windsor 4 days later. The Queen thus cast a melancholy figure, swathed in blue, the colour of royal mourning, as she ceremonially entered her confinement a few days later. Tudor women relied on their female relatives to assist them at the births of their children and to provide good cheer and support, but for her 4th birth Elizabeth of York had to make do without her own mother. After taking to her chamber, Elizabeth entered a female-dominated world, where the door was guarded by women determined to admit no man save the king. To facilitate this, the ladies of Elizabeth's household took on the official male roles, such as butlers and servers. It was a tradition that the usually active queen was, however, prepared to break. During one earlier confinement, while sitting in her rich bed hung with curtains embroidered with crowns of gold and royal arms, she received visits from 2 French ambassadors. It was a substantial breach of protocol, but a harmless one, since she was chaperoned by her mother-in-law, and her other ladies. Henry could also slip in quietly during the Queen's long and tedious days, if he so wished, but for most of the time Elizabeth tried to rest in her comfortable smocks, which, even in the privacy of her apartments, could be lavish in their gold collars and silk cuffs. Outside Elizabeth's chamber, life at court continued much the same as before, enlivened by the tournament. Its jollity was marred somewhat by the death at the lists of Sir James Parker, who swallowed his tongue when hit by a strike from Hugh Vaughan. Many others were also hurt, but such matters were, after all, expected at jousts. The king certainly did not appear openly concerned, spending the night of the 1st of July playing cards in his apartments. Perhaps his mind was on other matters, for apart from losing the high sum of £4 to his fellows, he had already been informed that Elizabeth had felt her labour pains begin. Contemporaries believed that a woman could recognize the coming of labour when certain dolours and pains began to grow about the gutters, the navel, and in the reins of the back, and likewise about the thighs and the other places being near the privy parts. Some women, such as Joan, the unmarried mother of the unfortunate Mary Cheese, were taken by surprise. Indeed, Joan might not even have known she was pregnant. She was out in a public place on the 1st of March, 1573, when she gave birth with such suddenness that the baby dropped to the ground head first beneath her mother's skirts. The little girl lingered long enough to be baptized, but the head injury was such that she died through mischance and from no other cause 7 days later. By contrast, Elizabeth of York was already an experienced mother and knew well what to expect. She moved to her pallet and perhaps put on the mantle of crimson velvet and ermine that had been provided for her to wear, though it was a far from practical item in the heat of early July. The Queen's trusted midwife, Alice Massey, was summoned as soon as labour began, as she had been for most, if not all, of her mistress's confinements. Good midwives who learned their trade by shadowing older practitioners were highly sought after by all classes of women. The profession, which was one of the most important occupations that a Tudor woman could undertake, was a potentially lucrative one if the midwife could attract the wealthiest clients. Since no formal qualifications were required to be a midwife, mothers of sufficient social status.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?